Welcome to Drive Through on US Modernist Radio. Between our regular podcasts, Drive Through has you meet interesting people, hear about great houses, and discover the rich history of modernist architecture, all in about 10 minutes, with your host, the man Dwell magazine called the Lorax of Modern Houses, George Smart.
I'm sitting in a dressing room where we've cobbled together a table out of old glass plastic crates and a wheel truck, and we've found a plug that works. And this is the green room of the historic Asolo Theater on the Ringling Estate Campus Museum of Art in Sarasota, Florida. And I'm talking with Sean Khorsandi with the Paul Rudolph Foundation. Welcome, Sean.
Good morning.
So what brings you to Sarasota?
Sarasota Mod Week. This is the second time we're participating. It's, I think, the third time that they've put together this weekend, Sarasota Mod Weekend, and it's a series of tours and talks. This year, it's focused around Paul Rudolph, and they've also done a model replica of the Walker Guest House, so that's sort of surrounding the hub of the festivities this week.
The Walker Guest House is a recreation, I understand, of a previous Paul Rudolph project, right?
It's a clone of a project that was actually the first independent project he did after he split with Twitchell. He actually stole the client. Mr. Walker had commissioned Twitchell and Rudolph to do a main house, which didn't get built. And afterwards, he contacted Rudolph about a guest house. And the story goes that Rudolph turned around the drawings in a week. This was an idea that had been sitting in his head. It's sort of this pure pavilion, 3 bays by 3 bays with the flaps, the spider in the sand, as they called it. And it got built. The problem is its location is only accessible by boat, so a lot of tourists haven't been able to see it. So the Sarasota Architectural Foundation wanted to bring it to the people, and they've made a clone here that's going to travel.
By truck, I guess?
Well, it's going to be dismantled. Joe King, who wrote, co-authored the early book on the Florida houses of Paul Rudolph for Princeton Architecture Press, re-engineered the building. So instead of having some standard lumber, they used glue laminated beams, and they made some modifications, but it's made to be demountable. And one of the venues, at least, will be the Walker Art Center as a future stop.
Now, what was special about the Walker Guest House architecturally?
I think it was just the purity of its time. It was the simplicity. Rudolph was looking at a project where he needed to bring materials in by boat. So he was looking for standard sizes, standard units, and he built this model pavilion to the materials available. Everything's on an 8-foot bay. Everything with standard sizes. It's 8 foot high. It's floating on the sand. And it's a very ephemeral piece of architecture. It was meant to work with the breezes of the surroundings. He understood that the Sarasota sun could get very hot, but they also had to worry about hurricane season. So he had these walls, the wall flaps that could create shadow and shade during the day and allow the cross breezes to pass through without getting the solar heat gain, and then at night batten down for security, and then also in the off season against hurricanes.
So describe for our listeners what it would be like to go into the door of the Walker Guest House.
The door would be the only probably secure piece of it. You're up 2 small steps above the sand, and then you're in one big open space. There's actually a small kitchen, a small bathroom, and one master bedroom, but you're open to a dining area, living area, and it's just very breezy. You would have a sense of a larger space beyond you because there's arms holding the structure outward, so it's framing something 1/3 larger on each side. So there's this sense of more, but you still feel like you're just in this temporal zone. It's a vacation house.
Very similar to, I would think, the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois.
In many ways. Edith Farnsworth always felt very exposed there because of all the glass in her settings. I think there was a difference of seclusion here being on an island. I think there was also a different sense of the surrounding population. And there's not the worry of coyotes here that Edith Farnsworth had.
Really? They had coyotes there?
They still do have coyotes there.
I had no idea that was an occupational hazard for the Farnsworth House.
Live and learn. You can't blame the architect for everything.
Right. Paul Rudolph came to national attention after he left Florida.
It really happened with his projects after leaving Sarasota, but it was a factor of the work the seeds that he sowed while he was here. Paul Rudolph, more than any others, was aware of his legacy from the beginning. And I think certain models, his role model in life was obviously, he had several, but a key one was Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright really took the bull by the horns, and he wrote his own autobiography. Frank Lloyd Wright was getting a lot of flack from America after having left his wife and children, after having stolen a client's wife. And Frank Lloyd Wright rewrote his story. He wrote an autobiography and decided how he wanted to tell it. And I think Paul Rudolph was aware of the spin factor. So from his drawings from the very beginning, he was always key on making larger drawings, making drawings that would reproduce well with the diazo printing method that the glossies like Architectural Forum and Progressive Architecture were using. And so he started making larger and larger renderings that could shrink down and print well. So of all of his houses in Florida, I think there was something like 45 at least that were published. And these weren't just published in Forum and PA and Record. They were also done in ladies' magazines. There was a house he designed later for the Ladies' Home Journal. He was just looking for the publicity to get something out there. And it was also for the moment of having it realized. The Cocoon House with its catenary roof, which is so popular, it leaked. It leaked very early on. He had this spray asbestos wrap cocoon that he was using for the catenary to enclose these steel bars. And his idea was taken from his time in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was something they used to wrap ships when they were out of commission. And almost immediately it was punctured and letting in rain. And he said, it's okay. You can do whatever you need to do after we take the photos. So it was more building his own legacy in the moment in real time.
And he went on to become head of the Yale Architecture School?
Right. So Gibson Daines, who was, in fact, the dean, the School of Architecture was its own school, but it was its own department, but it wasn't an independent school at the time. So it was still part of the School of Art and Architecture. It was a department within the school. And Gibson Daines, who was the grandfather to Claire Danes from Homeland, was the dean. And there was a bit of a shuffling. Yale was actually in a precarious position where it was almost about to lose its accreditation. And so there was a shakeup in the administration. Gibson Daines was put in, and Rudolph came. There was a discussion of who should be the dean. And at one point, they were considering Lou Kahn, who was a favorite of the faculty and other students. And Kahn had said, well, if I'm going to move here and relocate my office here, you need to give me a building. And the president of Yale had such a hard time dealing with Kahn with cost overruns and delays on the Yale University Art Gallery, which was at that point known as the Yale Design Center, that he refused to do it. So suddenly here comes Paul Rudolph with his southern drawl. He's very accommodating. He's flexible. He had a very small office here, and he was nimble enough to be able to and willing to commute. He wasn't tied down with a lot of big projects. He wanted to come up north. He moved to High Street, which is very close to school, and immediately he wound up with multiple commissions for the school. And the school of the A&A itself was a bit of a fluke. And this is part of the constant gridding between Kahn and Rudolph.
Yes.
2 floors of the design center were actually where the studios were. And it was Kingman Brewster and Whitney Griswold. Whitney Griswold at the time wanted to create a Lincoln Center of the Arts at Yale. And so his idea was to bring in the best people. So he brought in the paintings and sculpture curator from MoMA, and he came in and toured the facilities, and he saw that students were coming into the building at all hours. You could literally go touch a painting, pet a sculpture. There was no security, and he insisted, if I'm coming here, I need this facility. So initially, although it hadn't been part of Saarinen master plan for Yale, Rudolph was brought in to reconfigure where could architecture move. And suddenly, not only Kahn was quickly erased out of the picture. Suddenly there's a new building that's available. There's a new commission for Rudolph, which became the A&A. Suddenly Kahn's building is getting renovated. And as a matter of fact, Rudolph was brought in to do a very quick turnaround of the galleries. And this started creating the bristling between Kahn and Rudolph. I think Rudolph was maybe a little naive in going in and just quickly turning around the galleries, but immediately Kahn's infamous pogo sticks weren't used because these were always studio spaces, and it was a quick turnaround to turn them into galleries for Andrew Candroff Ritchie of MoMA. And Kahn just sort of broke ties with Yale. He didn't want to be in the building. He didn't want to look at the building. And there was always very hurt feelings between these two men who were both, in the history of Yale, favorite professors who sort of were ships passing in the night. As soon as Kahn left, Rudolph came in, and then he continued with more projects. Now,
Rudolph became known, at least through the public, for a lot of public housing projects and other large-scale ventures in the 60s that didn't quite work out. And they blamed the architect, but was it really his fault?
It depends on which ones you look at. One of his major projects is gone. It was torn down in 1981, and that was Oriental Masonic Gardens. And this was made out of trailers. And Rudolph thought, he was looking at statistics, and he was very worried about the population increase and the problem of housing people in cities. And he says, how is this going to be possible? So he talked a lot about this thing called the 20th century brick, which he thought was, the solution. And this was his prefab unit. And he used things based on what could fit on a trailer car. And at Oriental Masonic Gardens, he was doing housing, and it was the largest concentration of large co-op family housing. So they had even units up to 5 bedrooms. But everybody had a private entrance. Everybody had a courtyard. They were raised, and they were stacked like Jenga blocks. Because of a lot of pushback from the trades, although this had become a model, it traveled, it was at the HUD headquarters in D.C., everybody thought this is the future of public housing. There were a lot of issues. The manufacturers who were supposed to make it ran slow, so things had to be shipped from Virginia. Things were pre-wired within these thin panel walls, and they couldn't manufacture the roofs. So the roofs were made locally in Connecticut because they ended up not being brought through fully on highways. They brought them in via bay. It set off another regulation of a union that on site needed to do new plumbing work. And so things that were factory made, not meant to be messed with, suddenly had to have this new meeting. And then there was also the locally sourced roofs for these, which didn't quite fit right. They were a Teflon coating. So when they didn't fully meet the edges, there was a gap. And because the walls were already pre-wired, it was starting electrical fires.
Oh.
So to be sure, as soon as this started, a lot of people moved in. They were very popular. But it being a co-op, because there were all these cost overruns for having the unions involved, the money to finish off the landscaping, doing all the niceties and the finishing touches fell short. And people owning these co-ops, they were lower income, and they voted against any increase in maintenance, any increase or assessment. And so it quickly deteriorated. It was a muddy pit. It got unsafe. There were a lot of dark corners. So Rudolph's intent for having private spaces, enclosed outdoor areas, but a density of people, it's an architectural utopia, but in reality, with the Connecticut storms and winters, it didn't make sense.
Didn't work. In North Carolina, Rudolph is known for the Burroughs Welcome headquarters, most of which is still intact. But what are some of the buildings that the public would know about in the rest of the country?
Well, that's the funny thing about Rudolph. He's got a lot of buildings hiding in plain sight. Everybody's famous with Colin McKinnell Wood's Boston City Hall, and everybody thinks that Rudolph did it because it's a concrete, quote-unquote, brutalist structure, and I don't like that term. It's not the right term for it. It's action architecture. But in fact, he did a much larger complex not far away for the Boston Government Services Center. And that's a project right now that's been under consideration in Boston for some time to transform it to a community college. At 133 Federal Street, also in Boston, there's there's the Blue Cross Blue Shield building, and it was sort of an exoskeleton building where he had the mechanical inlets and the air inlet and exhaust running up the spine of the perimeter, which allowed him to squeeze another floor into the ratio for the height. So he put all the systems on the outside of the building, and this was meant as a unique headquarters. At the time, everybody was vacating Boston proper. They were moving along Route 22 and some of the other highways because that's where the tax breaks were. Because Blue Cross Blue Shield was a nonprofit, there was no benefit in taking advantage of any tax breaks because they weren't there for them. So they sort of were the first tall building in mid-century and downtown in this financial district of Boston, which sort of helped the renaissance of that area. Recently, under the previous mayor, there was a plan to replace it with the tallest tower in Boston, a tower so tall that even the FAA was asking them not to build it because it was messing up with the flight patterns in and out of Logan. And it was supposed to be adjacent to this tower, and Renzo Piano, who at one point was on that project, had asked, the intention was to remove Rudolph's building just to create a bigger plaza for it. So that has not come to pass either. So there's a lot of buildings that were earlier on in his career that are just sort of everyday buildings. They don't have that same presence or aura for architecture that you'd expect today, where students are coming from around the country to go visit. They're just everyday buildings.
Rudolph's buildings most recently have been under attack in different places in the country, especially in the Goshen area of New York, where the government center, after several legal challenges and offers to rescue the building, was pretty much demolished. I think a few pieces of it were saved.
It's a building that was built in 3 divisions, and in the 90s, actually a new wing for the judiciary was added, which is still there, which leaks. And it turns out County Executive Edward Diana was just hell-bent from the beginning on having this building removed. And this building was built for a new seat of government when Orange County came into its own, and it was meant to be a consortium for the 10 surrounding counties and villages and towns feeding into it. And in 2001, when a New York we had just been under attack. Eddie Diana was talking about getting rid of this government building. And we said, how would you pay for it? And he said, I'd charge people $5 to hack at it with a hammer. He was just very against the style of it, the look of it, and the feel of it. There's record showing that from the very beginning, after the first group who had seen the building realized sort of passed through their terms, there was some pushback against the building. This discussion that the roof leaked, or there's 77 roofs and they all leak, was a little bit of a misnomer because the roof was never fully patched. From the beginning, it always went to the lowest bidder. It was always a patch. And we've proven that actually the biggest problems to the roof happened because the county executive put roof tiles on the roof without proper spacers. Mm-hmm. So as the temperatures would change and the roof would expand and contract, they would grate against each other, actually ripping the roof membrane. So a lot of these problems that they're complaining about were self-imposed. So what they're doing there were 3 divisions, and they were very specifically, uniquely built to the program. They're removing one of them right now. So 2 will remain intact, but it's going to be this Frankenstein hybrid. You've got this clear Rudolph idea, this 1990s addition tacked on, and now some new building because people want to see glass buildings.
Rudolph passed away in 1997.
Correct.
And the Paul Rudolph Foundation was started after that. What is the foundation doing currently to extend his legacy?
The foundation sort of had a different role over the years, and I think initially it was done a little bit out of more heartfelt personal reasons. And of people on the board now, the majority of us did not know Rudolph directly. And it's more about education. This is our biggest battle in any case, whether it's the Cerrito House, the Mike Keels House, the Riverview High School, right now with Orange County, before that 10 minutes away in Chorley Elementary School. It's always a matter of going in and telling people what you have is key and important. And part of the concerns with Rudolph is he's a mixed bag. He did a lot of stuff. He did these ephemeral, light, lumber-based projects in Sarasota. He was looking for the lightness on the land. He was looking for the regional style. He's basically the grandfather of the Sarasota School of Architecture, as we call it. Moving up north, he was trying to refine architectural history, rediscover architectural history and sort of basis projects, sort of ground modernism, not just in pure forms, but in some referent. It was sort of an earlier, maybe modernist renaissance he was going for. As he started to get into his more heroic work, these what people might recognize improperly, what a lot of people consider brutalist buildings, these hulking masses that were meant to be institutions lasting forever. He did glassworks in Southeast Asia, these soaring skyscrapers. He did a lot of prefab. He did these super lush New York interiors. There's such a range. He's not just, a 1 or 2 trick pony. I always give the example of Marcel Breuer. He did a lot of fieldstone houses or the waffle concrete. So he's, A or B. Rudolph was A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, and beyond. He did furniture. He has his own arm of a lighting company that still exists. Rudolph was interested in all of it, and he always said, I don't care if I design the doghouse as long as you let me design it my way. So part of the thing with Rudolph is also, as I mentioned earlier, he was always conscious of his own legacy. So we have in the foundation a series of his CVs, and he would cross out projects. He would change dates. He would move things around, and he would deny authorship of some of these projects. My panel later today, I'm going to show some slides of a Macy's in Danbury, Connecticut. This is near the hometown where I grew up, and he designed 2 Macy's stores, one in Connecticut and one in Alabama. Some of the things he was doing was just to pay the rent, pay the bills, pay his staff. But he was someone who was curating his own legacy in real time. So we also have clients who come up and say, we have a Rudolph house. Will you help us sell it or help us restore it? He's like, you don't have a Rudolph house. And then they'll produce the drawings and they'll show us with his signature on them. Yet it doesn't show up on any list. It's not you can't find any of the drawings. You'll interview people who work for him, and they say that he would go through things and go through a tear and just say, destroy these drawings, go through these files, clear this out, ruin this. Some of previous employees have kept those drawings, and that's why they're surviving. There's discussions about, we're in Sarasota, the Sarasota Bradenton Airport. They say that it was just a project, and there's proof in the pudding that he actually did build an earlier version of the Sarasota Bradenton. This is also after his split with Rudolph, when he said, after his split with Twitchell,
yes,
where he said he couldn't ever work with another person. Basically, architecture is a singular act. Meanwhile, he collaborated with 2 other firms on that project. So how can you say one thing and then go back on it? He was definitely, if a project didn't turn out the way he wanted it to be, or if he didn't feel it was realized to the proper extent, he sort of denied authorship. So it's this cat and mouse game with Rudolph. Like, we have to learn who he was and try to put together these missing pieces. Sometimes he had earlier projects that were almost a maquette for the later famous projects that we see, but he would kind of want to downplay the earlier buildings so the new one would get the attention. Or he was figuring something out and working on it. So it's this cat and mouse game of us discerning what his legacy is and seeing where that fits, and then also telling other people to explain the history, to explain the story and see why it's important and significant. So a big thing of what we do is teaching and educating the public. It's very hard to just drop into a community it's usually the news is already broken that a new building is planned, such as in this case, Riverview High School in Sarasota, and then get people to change their mind midstream when tax-paying dollars have already been spent. And you've got a lot of boards and community boards and facilities that are on volunteer basis. They feel this is their claim to fame, having a new building. They don't know who these architects were. They don't really care. People come into a community and house values go up and down based on the school system. People think shiny new schools attract buyers, and that raises their house values. And a lot of times it's about getting people to appreciate something, and not everybody's going to like Picasso.
Right. Not
everybody's going to like Mondrian. So how do you get through the people who just want to come home, pay their taxes, and get to the next day to care about a building and preserve it, and to teach them why it's important? And a lot of these people maybe don't even fully understand or appreciate modernism.
If people want to get in touch with the Paul Rudolph Foundation, how can they do that?
We have a new website that's just been launched, paulrudolph.org, and information at paulrudolph.org is the fastest way.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Sean.
Thank you,
Appreciate
George.
it.
Likewise.
Visit us on the web at USModernistRadio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today. Our theme song is performed by Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio and Drive Through is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of residential design. I'm Tom Guild. Thanks for listening to Drive Through from US Modernist Radio.